Thank you for joining us for a webinar by ASTQB, the American Software Testing Qualifications Board. This webinar is made possible by ASTQA, the Association for Testing and Software Quality Assurance, the official exam provider for ASTQB. Today we're joined by Randy Rice, and we'll be talking about testing in the Agile SAFe methodology. In this webinar, Randy will explore how software testing can be performed in the Agile SAFe methodology. Randy covers the importance of having a strategic view of testing and how to tailor SAFe to fit your specific context. Also addressed in this webinar are the nature of the Agile Release Train, ART, roles in the ART, how teams work together to achieve quality releases, and how to improve acceptance criteria. Randy, thank you for joining us today. Take it away.
Hey, thanks a lot, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here today. So, we're going to be talking about what testing looks like in the Agile SAFe methodology. Just as kind of a quick intro of myself, I know that most of you who watch these webinars already know who I am, but in case you don't, I've been around, it seems like forever in doing this, 40 years experience in development and testing, 30 of that strictly devoted to just testing, and most of that as a consultant and trainer in testing, but I'm still a practitioner in what I do. So I still actually do testing, I do automation, I work on projects, I do all kinds of things around testing. I have all 5 advanced level ASTQB certifications, and I teach those as well. I was a co-author of the mobile tester syllabus, so I have that one, and the Agile Tester Foundation, and I'm also a director on the ASTQB, as well as now the treasurer of ASTQB. And way back in the mid-90s to 2000, I was the chairperson of QAI's annual software testing conference. I've written a couple of books with Bill Perry. One is Surviving the Top 10 Challenges of Software Testing. That's the one that we're most known for. And then there's another one called Testing Dirty Systems. And my day job, and sometimes my night job, is to be principal consultant and trainer of Rice Consulting Services here in Oklahoma City. So just as kind of at the outset, there's a kind of an interesting association when people hear the term Agile SAFe methodology or Agile SAFe just in general. I just have to come right out and say that no software development lifecycle model, Agile or otherwise, is safe. Okay, there's lots of risk in just about any lifecycle model or any project that you do. Okay, so it's kind of a nice little acronym and play on words there, but there's a lot of risk inherent to anything. And I'm not disrespecting SAFe as opposed to any other lifecycle model, but I'm just saying that, you have to keep your eyes on the risk. Now, the presentation that I'm giving today is based on the version 4.6 of SAFe, and that's the most current one. So if you're viewing this webinar at some point in the future, it may well be that there'll be a newer version of the model out there, maybe a 4.7, 8, whatever. And so just to kind of give us a point of reference on that. Now, one thing that has actually been developing for many years around Agile is that a lot of QA and test professionals have big questions about their role in Agile, but in particular, SAFe has some interesting wrinkles in it in terms of testing. So just to kind of put a little bit of context to this, way back when Agile first began as a named concept of Agile, and I say it like that because many of us in development and testing, we were doing some of the Agile practices way back before it was ever called Agile, way back before the Agile Manifesto happened in 2001. But early on in Agile, 2001, 2005, a lot of people were very much concerned about would Agile scale, because actually Agile started out as a very small concept. It was done by people all in the same room, and they were using 3x5 cards, and they were using sticky notes and things because they were all in the same room. They didn't really have to worry about a lot of the scalability of it. And honestly, this is still a big concern for a lot of people is how do you scale Agile? And so that is one of the big drivers of the scaled Agile framework, is that it's designed to be at the big picture of things. Now, a lot of Agile teams, even if you're not in SAFe or that methodology, even in other kind of Agile approaches, they still struggle with how do you apply testing in the Agile context. So in this presentation, my goals are to be as helpful as possible in finding out where you fit as a tester or perhaps a test manager in the Agile world, and especially in particular in the Agile SAFe methodology here, and to also show what companies have done when they have implemented testing in the scaled Agile framework, and to give you some ideas for how you can tailor SAFe for your own applications. Now, once again, I like to fall back on some key tenets and how I practice not only testing, but just projects in general. And one of those big tenets is that there's a saying that the magic is not in the method. And what is meant by that is that there's kind of this perception that has been around software development probably from the beginning, that if we could just find the right method, then everything would work out well. We would have better projects, we would have fewer defects, it would just all be so much better. Fred Brooks, who wrote The Mythical Man Month, called this the silver bullet solution. But history has shown us that this is not the case. If the magic were in the method, then we could just simply find that, and all of a sudden, all of our projects would get better, okay? But we know that every situation or context is different, either by a little or a lot, and there's a lot of nuances, around things, and so we have to take into account those nuances, and those nuances may be things like time constraints or other kind of limitations that may be seen in our projects. And so we have to understand that there's a lot more that wraps around this than just having a method in place. Another thing to consider is that Agile is much more a mindset and a philosophy than it is a methodology. And that became apparent early on in Agile, where the Agile Manifesto was put out to the world, and there were things like XP and Scrum and a few methodologies, but before long you started seeing these really thick books about Agile. Well, we always have to come back to, if you're really going to be Agile, it's not so much following all the steps exactly, because then you actually become less Agile in doing that. So we're going to talk about that a little bit in the presentation here. And it's also important to know that there are many flavors and approaches to Agile. Now, a lot of people are fixated on Scrum, okay, and some of those, but in this next slide here, I'm going to show that there are a lot of ways to do Agile. Now, some of the things you'll see on this slide, I don't really consider truly a lifecycle model, like continuous integration, continuous delivery. These are kind of like methods within the fuller life cycle, but you'll see things here like Scrum and Lean software and Kanban and extreme programming, those kind of things on the left, which are the more lightweight approaches. If you get over on the right, you'll see things like the Scaled Agile Framework, the Dynamic Systems Development Method, SDSM, DSDM rather. And you'll see that these are more well-defined kind of approaches and typically are more designed to scale up So anyway, that realization also needs to be made, because when we say agile, it could be it could have many different contexts and meanings depending upon which one you're actually talking about. Now, there was a book written not too long ago, and it's called Testing and Quality and the Scaled Agile Framework for Lean Enterprises by Dirk Jan de Groot and Mette Brun Pedersen. And I know Dirk, and he's a really good tester, really good testing author. They make an interesting comment here about SAFe in particular and testing applied to that. And the way they put it is, although the framework is described in more details than other comparable frameworks, it is not very elaborate on how testing and quality practices fit in. This raises new challenges for testers, QA and test managers, test architects, test specialists, and people in similar roles together with the entire organization. Now, the reason I put the quote up here on the slide is because that explains it very well. There's just not a lot of things that are called out in the framework as you would read through the documentation, go through the training, and all that. There's not a lot there that really addresses testing specifically. Now, with that said, one of my things that I've observed over the years, when it comes to life cycles especially, is that there's kind of a pendulum effect that happens. If we look at now, I guess we're almost 18 years out now from the Agile Manifesto almost, it is clear that people are actually still struggling with Agile in various ways, which to me is kind of amazing. That I'm starting to see people in the last few years really come back and say, hey, we need better requirements. We need better specification. Also, the communication between our developers and stakeholders isn't very good. So we need better communication. We need to know how testing adds value in Agile. And also there's this thing about testers becoming more technical in nature. It seems to be a trend in hiring. And also when you just look at Agile in general, there's a huge now percentage of adoption in Agile. Not everyone is doing Agile, but it seems they are. And the numbers show that, it's probably in the 90% of companies who at least think they're doing Agile. And that's a key point too. Not everyone that thinks they're doing Agile is actually doing Agile or using that on their projects. So there's also some things around this too, getting better at automation, knowing what to test, and the testers, even with Agile, are still spread too thin. So this pendulum is swinging constantly in our industry between less definition, which would be more on the Scrum side, to more definition, which would be on things maybe like CMMI or even the Scaled Agile framework for that matter. And the more definition that gets in place, then there's usually a pushback from that, which swings the pendulum in another direction, and we skinny down our specs, we skinny down our documentation, and then people say, I don't have enough to work with. So then it swings back in the other direction. And so it's kind of crazy when you start thinking about it, but it's what keeps vendors and people like me in business, I guess. So one of the things, since I'm one of these guys that have been around like forever, back when the capability maturity model was introduced, there were many of us in the testing community that were really distressed because it didn't even mention testing at all in the early models of the CMM. And we really had to fight to get some of that into the CMM and the CMMI. And I have a feeling that we'll probably see close to that same thing work out with SAFe. But the irony here is that Agile was originally all about simplicity. and being able to respond to change and not being heavy. If you look at SAFe and that framework, it's much more prescriptive than any of the other methods, the other Agile methods. Now, I'm going to get into showing a picture of the framework here before too much longer, but still just a few more framing concepts. One of the things that I think about quite often in software development and testing is the law of the instrument. This is something that is attributed to a lot of people, but is most often attributed to Abraham Maslow, who says, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And the reason I say this is because I was around with a lot of Agile practitioners in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they were seeing Agile as the solution for everything. And, that's kind of human nature in some respect, but, there's a whole rich domain of information out there about software lifecycle models. And one of the big things is to fit the model to be what you need. And in some situations, sequential actually makes more sense than Agile or iterative. And so you really kind of have to look at it to say, well, are we using the right technique for the job at hand? And even within that, are we using the right flavor of that, as we saw in the umbrella slide? So we always have to be aware of that. Now, one of the big things that people are concerned about with Agile is, well, what role does management have here? And I've kind of framed this in what I call the zone of uncertainty, okay? And so management in a traditional world of testing, you have these teams that work in silos and groups, and you're dealing with very strict project management, perhaps using things like Gantt charts and those kind of things. You have very firm schedules with start-stop dates, and you'll hear it called in Agile, especially the command and control style. They don't call it that for what they do in Agile, but they will refer to what's done in traditional as command and control, where you have a boss that tells people what to do or a manager that tells people what to do. And you go here, you go there, that kind of thing. Now, on the right side of this slide is more of the Agile side of things, where you have the self-directed teams. You have the estimates that the teams will make by consensus generally, and you get priorities that are set pretty much on a daily basis. So at this point, you're not dealing so much with a management mindset as you are with a leadership mindset. Now, if you're a manager in a traditional world and you're looking at going into something like SAFe as your new domain and how you're going to do things, and you're going from management to leadership, then what happens is you go across this chasm or this zone of uncertainty, as I'm calling it here, where you're not really sure what to do. Okay. And so this is where a lot of the confusion comes in. Now, the problem here and what makes this zone a little bit challenging is that many organizations, they really want to be Agile, but because of the culture, they're still kind of in the more traditional world, because maybe their management wants firm estimates. They want to have more control. They want these hard targets to shoot for, specific dates, and they want to be looking at some of the work products like requirements as opposed to working software, which Agile will deliver or is designed to deliver. And there's this little issue also with human resources, because they don't always sync up with the Agile philosophy either. They may be wanting to hire people that may have experience in some of the other approaches. So some of the test managers have problems in letting go of some of those traditional techniques that they use to stay in control. When I teach my tutorial on becoming an effective test team leader, one of the things that I talk about is about how do you see the difference between managers and leaders. And managers are all about making sure that things go on schedule, they're staying within budget. Basically, they're trying to keep the project, as we say in Oklahoma, between the ditches, okay? They're trying to keep things going down the road and everything in control. So when you get into leadership, then you have to think about, how do I inspire people? How do I encourage people? How do I make sure people are working together and communicating and those kind of things? It's not so much keeping track of schedules now as it is of working with people. So that's why this zone of uncertainty. People are asking, how do I make this journey from manager to leader? And even, can I make it? Am I that kind of person? Because managers and leaders are kind of different skill sets and makeup of an individual. It is good if you have managers and a manager and leader in that same body of a person, but not everyone is cut out to be that. And what if I don't want to let go of the traditional ways I'm doing things? And will I lose my test team that I love so well? And what will my role be? There's a lot of questions rolling around in the minds of managers these days. Now, one more thing before we get into SAFe. When I talk about testing, I always talk about the idea of efficiency, because you can approach testing in some really inefficient ways. And one of the best ways I've been able to explain testing to people, and especially those in management who think that we'll just test something at the end when it's done, is I use this coffee pot analogy, where let's say I make a pot of coffee and something goes wrong, maybe the filter collapses or something, and I wind up with a bunch of grounds in the coffee. Now, I don't know about you, I'm kind of a coffee connoisseur in a way, and I love a good cup of coffee. In fact, to be more accurate, I love several good cups of coffee per day. I have one going next to me right here. But I don't like grounds in the coffee. You know, they're annoying. They get in your mouth. You have to spit them out or something. And so grounds in coffee are not a good thing. Even more so, I hate paying for them, like if I go to a coffee shop. So the problem is, how do I get rid of the grounds of the coffee? Now, the grounds in this case are the representation of a defect in software. There's something that I don't want to be in there. Now, the coffee pot, the coffee is dark. You can't really see inside of it very well. And so some of the grounds you'll see floating at the top. Some, though, are going to be at the bottom. So how do we get rid of these grounds? Well, you could go in with a pair of tweezers or your fingers or whatever, or a spoon, and you could bring them out one or maybe a few at a time. And just like in testing, every ground that you find and you put to the side is a success. I found a defect. I found a ground. Okay. But the problem is, the more you do that, then the harder the grounds become to find. And then you just get the feeling, this is crazy. You know, this is a total waste of time. I'm finding grounds, but I know I'm not going to find all of them. So a better solution would be just to simply get you a new filter, put it in the pot, and pour the pot through that filter again into something else, a cup of coffee or empty cup or something like that, and let the filter then remove the grounds. Now, that's what I encourage people to do in testing, is to see your testing as a series of filters, not at the very end of the project, because if the filter collapses or fails in some way, then a lot of defects are going to be seen out by your customers. But you may have a filter of reviews and walkthroughs, and you may have a filter of unit testing and perhaps integration testing and system testing and UAT. And you may say, well, what do those have to do with Agile? Well, you can do all of those in Agile, okay? There's no rule or anything that says you cannot do different levels of testing within an Agile context. Now, just as kind of a quick aside here, when I pose this to a group, I'll ask if anyone else sees any solutions, and I get all kinds of interesting answers back on this. One person just says, well, if you just let the coffee pot set long enough, all the grounds go to the bottom, and you can just drink off the top. And I said, oh, yeah, you must be the project manager in the group. Or then you have some people say, well, just use instant coffee. And I said, that's a really great idea. Now we have a trade-off between flavor and taste and the reality that we don't have grounds in the coffee. So in Agile, there's a lot of emphasis on speed, right? And that would be a really quick way to solve it. But you may not have the full coffee experience that you would perhaps might like to have there. But anyway, think about filters as you start thinking about testing. And what I'm about to start showing you here will make a lot more sense. Okay, now we have this really big diagram, okay? This is the full model of SAFe, version 4.6. Now, I'm going to, at this point, just for the ease of presentation here, I'm going to flip over to the SAFe website, okay? And so this is the Scaled Agile Framework website. And in the website diagram of this, you'll see right there, you'll see that there's actually various representations of this whole model. Now, it's really hard to wrap your mind around the first time you see it, okay? But I'm just going to show you a couple of things. First of all, this is the full SAFe picture up here. And you have different levels here. You have the portfolio, which is kind of all of your organization's projects that may be going on at any one time. You'll notice here that this is very strategic, and you have like the portfolio canvas. You have the big picture of the backlog and the budgets and those kind of things. And then you have what's known as the value streams, at which point you'll have certain projects underway to achieve certain points of value, okay? Then you have the large solution level, which is where now you're building big solutions, big systems. This is where the scaled part comes into play. And you have the solution train down here. And then you go down a little bit further into the program level, okay? Now, this is where you're starting to look at things in a context of how do we release stuff, okay? So you'll have your various stakeholders here as well. You'll have your backlog here. But now we introduce this Agile Release Train. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about this more, but this is where you come up, this is where you actually are doing continuous delivery. And as some of you may well know, there's differences in how you see some of these things, like continuous integration versus continuous deployment versus continuous delivery. But you have this package that can be released on demand, is the concept here. And this is where you see a lot of DevOps happening. Now, finally, at the lower level, as I kind of jokingly but seriously also say it, this is where all the work happens, okay? So this is your team level. And you'll notice here that the built-in quality, the idea here is that if you do things right, you're building in quality, you're not having to test it in, which I agree with that. I just kind of also have the belief that you still need to test even when you do build in quality. Definitely you want to build things in like performance and usability and security and all the rest, but you'll see the iterations going on here, and you'll see all different kind of things under work here. Now, let's go back up to the top for just a moment. You can, if you want to, see this as Essential SAFe, okay? Now, this is a much smaller picture because now you're just dealing with the program level and the team. And for some people, this may be exactly what they need. You may not have that need for the larger solution. Then you have the larger solution SAFe, which has the three levels: the large solution, the program, and the team. You have the portfolio, which adds the portfolio level onto this. And then you can be back where we were before, the full SAFe, where you have the portfolio, large solution program, and the team level. So just the takeaway from this is there's a lot of stuff that is shown in this, and you can tell they really spent a lot of time developing this. Now, one of the other reasons I want to show it on the website is that these are hyperlinked. Okay, so like if you want to know more, let's say about the Agile Release Train, all you have to do is click on it, and it will take you into a description of the Agile Release Train and what it does, and all the things. We're going to look at a few of these things as we go forward here in the presentation. But you'll see the roles and how you define it, and there's a lot of information behind what's going on in that Agile Release Train. And that's just kind of as an example of doing that. Okay, so back to the presentation here. Now, the big question is, okay, well, where does testing fit in to all of this? So in the book that I referenced earlier by Dirk John de Groot and Mette Broom Peterson, they talk about a method they used, and you'll see here's the big printout of the model. Now, I think they were probably using either 4.5 or 4.4 in doing this, but it looks still pretty close to what we're doing. This was created at an expert session at a conference in 2017, and the goal here was they wanted to know where in the scaled Agile framework could testing be involved, where could it measure things, and where could it add value. And so they used the sticky note approach. So every place that they found that testing had some kind of point of intersection, they put a sticky note there. And as you can see, they found quite a few places for that to happen. And that might be a very helpful way for your own organization to identify how to integrate testing into SAFe, because not every organization will see it quite the same way. So I really do encourage you to check out that resource there to see how it might play out in your own situation. So any life cycle model needs to be tailored for specific needs. It doesn't matter if you're doing agile, sequential, waterfall, anything. And in fact, SAFe talks about this. One of the quotes out of the SAFe 4.5 version, this was the textbook version, is that SAFe is configurable and allows an organization to adapt the framework to its business context. It supports smaller scale solutions employing 50 to 125 practitioners. I thought that was kind of interesting, as well as complex systems that require thousands of people. So it's perfectly acceptable to do this. I love to tell stories about things that I've seen in testing, and I don't want to take a lot of time on this story, but there was a time, I believe this was around 2005, maybe right around in there, 2006. I was speaking at Star West, and Brett Petticord was there at the conference, and he and I were both planning to go to a chapter meeting of the Orange County QA group. And so he was the speaker that night, and I was just there. I wanted to go meet some people there that I was supposed to talk about, maybe doing a presentation in the future. So I was planning on going anyway, asked Brett if he wanted to ride. So we rode together to the meeting. And so he had like this whole slide deck that he was going to present on Agile testing. Now, out in the Orange County area, there's a lot of defense contractors and a lot of people that do these really big, complex systems. And man, I was in the back of the room, and Brett got into about 3 of his slides, I believe. I don't think he got any further than that, 3 or 4 slides, because he was just getting peppered with questions. Well, how do you do this if you have, 5,000 people working on a jet engine and they're all scattered around the world. And, how do you deal with a situation where you have a database with 2,500 entities in it? And, they were great questions. And I was just thinking to myself, man, I'm glad I'm not up there. So just keep in mind that, some people have these huge, huge scales of projects that are going on. And so that's one of the drivers actually for people to adopt SAFe, because it does bring into play some more regimented activities. So it is possible, though, and this is the point I want to get back and reemphasize, that testing and quality can be seen at each of those levels that we saw in the model. At the portfolio, you're more strategic. At the large solution, your focus is more in the business, so you're thinking about more like business scenarios. At the program, you're talking about the Agile Release Train at that point. And then at the team level, you're talking about how you actually do things. So let's kind of go through each of those, and then we will have some wrap up here. So at the portfolio level, this is that very strategic level. This is where you're looking at the what and the how of what you're doing. And so there's both technical and cultural aspects of development going on at that level. And this is one of the best places that you can actually embed quality into the organization, because this is where senior level decisions are being made. This is where quality objectives are being put into place. So if quality is not talked about at that portfolio level, then it's going to be very hard to see it in the other levels, because it's not been named as a priority by the people who actually should be driving that. I always say that quality is an organizational decision. Okay, if management doesn't set the bar for quality, then probably no one else is going to care about it. Now, one of the things that has kind of emerged over the last, 2, 3, 4 years is this idea of a chief quality officer. And SAFe doesn't really talk about this, okay? But it could fit very well into SAFe, where you have this person, a chief quality officer, where they have governance and compliance responsibilities if those are required. And they're not only advocates for testing, but just overall quality in general. And they make sure that the metrics are being tracked and that they're giving value, making sure the process is running smoothly. They drive the continuous improvement, and also they can do things like have a focus on reducing technical debt, adopting new technologies. There's a lot of digital transformations either happening or getting ready to happen. And I don't think a lot of people are fully aware of how much change is on the horizon coming at us, especially in these digital transformation projects. And you need someone at the very senior levels in an organization to make the point that if we don't get it right, we're going to be in big trouble. So that would be the role of the chief quality officer. Now, if you're at the large solution level, the business outcomes are very important at that level. And so testing and QA, they can be planning and measuring to those business outcomes, as well as being a way to communicate to the teams what the business goals are. Now, it's really important that you just don't automatically assume that the teams understand that business perspective. In fact, in my experience, it's very common for teams to get so kind of sucked into doing things, doing the activities, that they lose sight of why they're doing what they're doing. And so they're focusing on developing features, testing it, delivering it, but they may totally miss the business goals. And then also to coordinate testing at that strategic level, especially if you're testing things that are very integrated and very technical. Even though you have testers in the individual teams, you may very well need them at a large solution level to test the big picture, the big integrated picture of the thing that you may be delivering. And there's also this idea of communicating the value of testing to the rest of the organization through the analytics and through the metrics that are captured in testing. it's one thing to capture those metrics, but someone has to make sense of them and communicate them to the rest of the organization, or else they just kind of are of no effect. They just kind of languish there. And also, someone needs to be in place to equip teams with the things they need for successful testing: the training, the tools, the methods. It's almost like the center of excellence idea. I didn't use those words here in the slide, but it's really almost like that. Then at the program level, this is where we have the Agile Release Train, or the ART as it's called in SAFe. Now, there's this idea of a long-lived team of Agile teams that are just continually doing these releases, okay? And it's almost, in the world of Scrum, you would think of it as you're like sprinting forever kind of thing, which I don't think, by the way, is a good idea. But you'll see these teams that are just, they're together. They're not together for just a few weeks or a few months. They're almost permanently established. And these teams, they continue to develop and deliver solutions incrementally. And they typically have fixed length iterations within what's known as a PI, or program increment time box. Now, each ART is its own little virtual organization that can be somewhere between 50 and 125 people. That I don't know how they round up with exactly 125. That's what the SAFe model talks about. But anyway, it's kind of in that range of people that will plan, commit, and execute together. Now, you may be watching this and say, well, wait, I don't have an organization that big. Well, that's fine too. I mean, you don't have to be that big, but the point is, SAFe is intended to scale. Okay, so they make the assumption you're dealing with a larger organization. You can apply it at a smaller organization. It's just that the goal of SAFe is to scale, so they talk about it in the larger picture. So this Agile Release Train, as we pointed out earlier, is found at this point in the overall model here. And you'll see continuous exploration, integration, continuous deployment, and then at any point you should be able to release on demand. Okay, so that's where it's found. Now, the thing about ARTs is that there's a cross-functional nature to them. And the idea is that ART has all the capabilities needed in it to define, implement, test, and deploy new system functionality. So, for example, that could be a software and hardware, firmware, DevOps, and others would be developed, and also has the ability to implement and test and deploy new system functionality as it may be needed. So your objective with the ART is to have this continuous flow of value, delivering products or delivering releases that have immediate value to the users. And this is, as I mentioned, typically a ongoing thing, and most people are dedicated to that train full time. And they may never actually leave it once they get on it. You know, it's kind of like always ongoing. And so to give a little bit other perspective here to what this looks like, what's going on is you have this role of defining new functionality in here and then implementing it in code, doing testing. You could be testing and implementing at the same time, but then you also have this acceptance test activity, and then you have the deployment. So in any case or at any point that you feel like you need to deploy the solution, you should be able to. Now, keep in mind that along this train, you have multiple iterations going on. So the choice to deploy really depends upon do we have the overall solution in place that will actually give value to our users. So there's a few points here that I bring out about acceptance tests being aligned to user stories, these acceptance tests, as well as the TDD test, still tend to be very general and basic at this point. So you might be well concerned to think about things beyond functional acceptance tests, like performance testing and security testing, usability. Where do they fit in? And then another question might be, well, what about structural tests beyond test-driven development? Because TDD is mainly functional in nature. You're not testing code branches and loops and those kind of things. And then what happens after deployment? Are you going to monitor things? So those questions are not really answered for you in this ART. These are things that you need to figure out, and these are the reasons why I personally believe that you need other levels of testing going on for things such as performance and security and usability and so forth. Now, just as kind of an example, let's look at a user story. Now, a user story typically is framed in a little bit different way. It might be, as a software user, I want to do something so that, something else can happen. Now, in this case, it's described simply as a feature, okay? An in-service software update. You could say, as a customer, I want the software to have in-service software updates so that I do not have to apply them manually. Okay, something like that. Now, the acceptance criteria here are listed. And by the way, I took this directly from the second edition of the textbook for this. Nonstop routing availability, automatic and manual update support, rollback capability, support through existing admin tools, and all enabled services are running after the update. Now, I'm going to say something here in regard to specifications, and that is that it's a lot easier to spot maybe a flawed specification than it is to write a really good one. And that applies to user stories as well. So with that spirit in mind, I don't mean to be super critical here, but let's think about some of the concerns we might have with this, like what constitutes nonstop? How far back do we roll back? Which admin tools would be applicable here? And so as we start looking at it like this, then, we realize that it takes someone with test analysis and design expertise, as well as understanding of the domain and what the customers are going to be doing, that will design acceptance tests and other forms of tests as well that really truly do validate the solution. So this is a common problem actually with all forms of Agile, that you may have very skinny user stories, and you also may have very loose and sometimes ambiguous acceptance criteria with those. So, there's a good role here for testers to kind of help make some of this more specific. Now, of course, one of the big things that Agile does is it will take people out of silos, like we see here, business and software quality testing, compliance, and you will embed those people into the cross-functional teams that you'll see involved in the Agile Release Train. Now, these teams are cross-functional and they span disciplines, and so they can happen at both the team and the program levels, and the intent here is to have a leaner organization and without the delays and the bureaucracy that happen in trying to communicate between the silos. And so, excuse me, the main purpose of this, and as it says here from the textbook, is that the result is a faster flow of value with minimum overhead. And that's the main purpose of the Agile Release Train, is to have this really efficient kind of vehicle that will deliver software quickly. So let's talk about the roles in ART real quickly here. You have the business owners that are your stakeholders, typically a smaller group, that they have the overall business and technical responsibility for all the things around the ART solution, for the governance, the compliance, return on investment. And they also evaluate that solution's business value to make sure that it is fit for use, and they actively participate in the ART events. So you could actually see here that they would be probably perfectly acceptable to have involved in acceptance testing. Now, the customers are the ultimate buyers of the solution. They may not be actually the users of the solution, but they are at least the buyers. And so they also have to be continuously involved for success. Then you have the system team, that this is the core team that actually will design and build and test the solution, especially with test automation and continuous deployment involved. And they also help with integration and do end-to-end solution testing. So you may actually have even a larger team to do that end-to-end testing. And then you have the shared services. That might be people like security professionals, information architects, database administrators. These are all in support roles for the other team. Now, some other program level testing considerations is that the program increments and those objectives are used to steer the collection of the feedback and information. For example, testing analytics would be one of those. And a quality strategy will be how this happens. Now, the quality strategy also needs to address the quality of your test. So, for example, do the tests need reviews and audits, and do people need to have coaching on how they do their testing, as well as perhaps a clear strategy that will align the teams and their work, and also give some shared insight on things that have to be done. One of the reasons for this is because many times organizations simply lack the big picture, the overview, and then within that, how to drill down and how to focus on certain things. So there's a lot of strategic as well as tactical activities that need to happen here. Now, just a word about integration testing is that one of the big challenges for scaled organizations is how do we do integration and those kind of higher levels of testing. So it's really hard to organize those kind of cross-team activities from within the teams themselves. So that's why at the program level of SAFe, you have activities to help kind of facilitate integration. So it's a good practice to make sure that the end-to-end integration is a starting point for the planning of the development and the cross-team collaboration as well. And also testers and test managers should emphasize that quality mindset so that people are thinking about integration testing early on in your PI planning. Now, finally, we're getting down to the lowest level. We have the team level testing. And this is where you really start to see this core value of built-in quality. And so this helps make sure that every critical success factor you need to have, whether it be performance or security or usability, all those things are built in throughout development. Now, you'll also see things like test-driven development, paired working, where you have like a tester and a developer working side by side. Now, sometimes you may have testers that are not able to code, but are still pairable with team members to run the test and to discuss the results of the test with the developers. But the big thing to take away from this is that testers can take a leading role in order to make sure that all the team members learn and use agile testing methods. You may be, as a tester, the evangelist of testing within that little team. So throughout the development of stories and features, the testers can also pair with the other team members to define and test certain constraints that they may see in those stories. They may also pair with a product owner or BA to consider some of the non-functional aspects that need to be tested. And if those testers have some of the skills like security and usability or performance testing, they can contribute to those non-functional kinds of tests in the Agile teams. So to kind of start bottom lining this here, we have some pretty big questions and implications as we look at something like SAFe, like who coordinates testing and other activities at the large scale? Who's going to answer some of the tough questions coming from the C-suite, especially when projects may get delayed or we have maybe a bad release or something. Who improves the processes if we feel like they need to be improved, or even knows that they need to be improved? And then who performs the tests that must also be tested at a large scale, like performance and security and those kind of things. So in summary here, despite despite having a fairly sparse treatment of testing roles and responsibilities in SAFe, there's still many opportunities for testers and test managers to add value, just as we saw on that slide with the sticky notes. And it's important that you tailor your SAFe implementation to include some of the important testing activities. And that all starts by having a good test strategy that really brings out what is important, who will be involved, at what points can they be involved. It's the big picture of what you're trying to do. So at this point, I'm going to check back with Dave and see if we have any questions now.
Thanks, Randy. So you've done a great job of taking what is a lot of information and distilling it down to what I think is very useful for those interested in software quality. But that said, the first question is, SAFe looks pretty complex. Is training required, or can we do this on our own? What do you recommend?
Well, you know, it is very complex. And as I did show, if you go out to the SAFe website, you can read about things on your own. And there's also books written on SAFe. I'm just a big believer in training. Okay. I'm a big believer in skill building. And I believe there's a certain synergy that happens when you have multiple people in the room talking about something. And when you have the experience of a trainer that has been in multiple projects doing things. So while training may not be required, I think it's really value added and highly recommended. And I don't think it should be seen as kind of an optional appendage that should be out there. I think with all kind of life cycles, training is really helpful because people just don't get trained on them. I mean, testing is one of those things that typically gets deprioritized, and even more so, many times it's how you do development. I mean, people get lots of training in languages and tools and things like that, but they often fail to get the training in the bigger picture things. And so this is pretty complex. It's probably at least a week. There are certifications around it, by the way, but you know, for self-study, I think it can only take you so far. I think it's one of those things where the team needs to be trained so they will know how to work together. And I think that all happens in kind of like a workshop format in best. So it may not be required, but it's a really, really good idea. If you don't do it, it's probably a risk factor on your projects.
Yeah, no, I recall talking to some advanced testers who have told me that one of the best aspects of training is actually being able to talk to other testers when possible from other organizations, because they learn so much from their perspective and their own war stories, if you will.
Yeah, and Dave, I think that I'll just kind of chime in too on that. I think that one of the things that we're losing in training, and of course I'm a training provider, so I see it all the time, is that we've just made this huge shift, you know, over the last 2 to 3 years into virtual, even live virtual training and all that. But it doesn't give you the same experience as when you're with the group live all together. And, you know, it's a richness that you just miss when you're not all in the same room. So I'll just put that out there for any managers who might be listening.
Yeah, no, I agree. So one of the other questions is, okay, and it probably ties back to that first one, that, you know, there's a big diagram, there's a lot of stuff going on there. So the question is full adoption of SAFe required?
You know, the thing about it is they put that essential SAFe in there for a reason. I'm going to go back here to answer that question. That they put the essential SAFe in here for a reason, because they knew that there would be people that just wanted to apply this, let's say, on a particular project or group of projects. And so you don't have to have all levels necessarily. It is designed to scale, okay? And the idea of scaling is you start small and you build up. So you can do this somewhat incrementally. And in fact, once you start looking at this, you'll see that there are elements that many people in Agile may do separately, like Kanban and XP and Scrum, and getting your backlogs together. And a lot of this is going to look pretty familiar. You know, you could, for example, be doing Scrum and decide we want to transition to scaled Agile. And this little map would probably give you a good guide to that. And by the way, there's one thing that I didn't call out here. In the newest version, 4.6, they've made a distinction up here, enterprise versus government, because there's a lot of government organizations now adopting this. So I know I'm straying from the question now, but you don't need the full adoption, in my opinion at least, of doing this. And I think that's why they did put it in there. But the thing that you gain by the bigger picture adoption and implementation of this is really important stuff that needs to be happening at the very high strategic level. So if you just do the essential, you may be able to get your work done, but you may miss the strategic view of things on projects, which is really an important view.
No, that's a great point. So this next question comes up, and I kind of understand where they're coming from. I didn't hear the word test manager necessarily used very much in the presentation. So the question is there a role for a test manager in SAFe?
I believe there is. And here's why. You know, let's say that we were talking about, I'm going to put this slide back up here for a second. Let's say we're just talking about development, okay? And you have a team of developers and they're working in Agile teams. Would you have a development manager? I believe you probably would. Because there's other things that goes on in development besides just what goes on in the team. Same thing with testing. I believe that you would need to have someone in a test management role. Now, in Agile, it starts to look a lot more like leadership, okay? There are things that test managers have traditionally dealt with that just simply don't translate into Agile, like the firm estimates and the command and control and those kinds of things. It's a different, you have to let go of some things to have those self-directed work, those self-directed teams. So we still need people who can oversee things, or at least kind of make sure that things are all going in the right direction. But they're doing it in more of a leadership mindset than a management mindset. So what this is causing test managers to have to kind of retool their skills and to refine their skills into becoming less kind of control people, spending less time in a spreadsheet, let's say, and more time with the team.
That's a good answer. And we did a recent podcast that talked about that whole leadership thing. And I know you've done some white papers in the past on leadership. So good stuff there. All right. So we have time for one last question. And, maybe it comes down to wow, this sounds great. We're really going to pitch this. But can you tell me, let's just recap, as you said at the very beginning, SAFe is not necessarily safe. Nothing is safe. So what are some of the risks in using SAFe? Again, great stuff here, but what are some of the risks?
Yeah. There are certain risks, I think, that are inherent for all different kinds of projects. And some of them just kind of translate. It's not necessarily that SAFe is missing out on these, but it's just things to be aware of. Like one of the big ones is lack of stakeholder engagement. You start embarking on projects and you're not really consulting with your key stakeholders, and you're at high risk of delivering the wrong solution. Another one is you try to deliver too much. And one of the things about Agile is that it kind of helps guard against that, because you're not thinking in terms of, let's build the 50-story skyscraper. Let's start with a 10-story one and we'll build a little higher as we go on. But a lot of times projects tend to be overweighted with things, which can be a risk. As far as SAFe goes, though, I would say that the number one thing that I see, two things actually. One is getting the right skills to actually use this methodology in the right way. And that's where we kind of tie back into the training. So lack of training and knowledge and experience in using SAFe can be a risk factor. And in fact, the first time you do anything, you're at a risk of making mistakes because you just don't know what you don't know yet. That's kind of a natural one, but also the fact that you have to kind of define to yourself, where are we going to assess quality? That is, do testing. That becomes kind of a risk because, in my experience, it takes a pretty high level of expertise to print this out, put it on a wall, and do all the sticky notes in the right places. And even though that sounds real easy to say, we're going to do a workshop and we're going to put sticky notes on this chart and say, where are all the places that that testing fits in? I'll find that picture here. I'll just tell you that it takes people that really know about testing. It takes people that can see the big picture of things. And it's really easy to miss key filters here that would allow defects to just very easily just go right on into production. And one other thing, Dave, I would call out, if you look at what they did in this diagram, this is where this Agile Release Train is where most of the work happens. But look at where most of the sticky notes are. They're not around this big point of delivery here. There are significant ones down into where the team is at, but there's also early stuff going on. And I think it's very significant to look at that. And if you don't have that kind of activity going on to assess things and measure things, then yeah, you're going to have the big risk there of building things that are either incorrect or having ambiguity, like we saw in the sample user story. That's another risk, actually, is just inherent ambiguity that people do when they write user stories and such.
Great information, Randy. Great information. I want to thank you again for taking time to join us today, and I want to invite the listeners to look for additional resources as well on the website of ASTQB.org, as well as ATSQA.org. And certainly, if you have questions, go ahead and contact Randy. He's got his contact information there. I know there's a lot to take in here, and I'm sure there are more questions that are out there. So, again, I want to thank you, Randy, for the time that you've shared with us today, and I hope you can join us again in a future webinar or podcast.
Thank you, Dave. Good to be here.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we look forward to having you participate by listening again and submitting any questions, or just giving us ideas of things you'd like to hear about in future podcasts or webinars. So we'll see you next time.